Hello everyone, welcome back to JD Mods. Today's video is the part 2 of the MR2 quarter panel replacement. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, go watch that first. As you can see, my MR2 here has the quarter panel removed, and in today's video we are going to be welding on the new quarter panel. Over here is the old quarter panel. As you can see, it was all dented, rusty, and full of bondo, which is why we removed it. You guys have all seen me take the car to this stage. And here is the new quarter panel that we are installing. It is basically rust-free, bondo-free, and will be a nice addition to my car. So we're going to start today's video by preparing the quarter panel. In the last video I cut it to the exact size, so we are all done the cutting, which was the hardest part arguably of the quarter panel preparation. Next, what we're going to do is tackle these 3 spoiler holes. So I'm going to be filling these in because I'm using an aftermarket spoiler that doesn't use these holes. Bondo is not a good idea as it could just fall straight through if you go over a bump really hard or someone hits it in that exact spot. So all I did first is used a wire wheel to clear the area around the holes, but we are actually going to be welding it from the inside of the panel. Here we are inside the panel. You can still see the 3 holes. I haven't wire wheeled anything away yet. As you can see, there's a minor bit of rust around all 3 holes. So let's first take our wire wheel and clean up that rust and get a nice area for welding. So I've ground off the rust and cleaned it up a little bit with my degreaser. And now it is time for welding. So I got my ground nice and close, pretty much as closest to these holes as I can. Now when you're welding a hole like this, just plug welding a hole. The only way I know to do it is with this type of copper backing plate. So this one's for doing holes. I'll show you guys up close. These are just some pliers I got, vice grips pretty much. And you just clamp on the panel and it provides a backing surface because welds don't stick to copper. So these are very handy for welding holes on flat panels, but obviously I cannot fit them behind my panel on this quarter panel. So instead I just have some sheet copper here. I think this is around 2 millimeters thick, whatever that is in inches. So I've cut off a little piece, added a little radius to it to help get inside the hole. I also have this big sheet which is better for holding on to because it doesn't get as hot. I also have a magnet that I can use to help me hold the copper behind the panel. So like I said, we're going to be welding from the inside of the quarter panel, so all the splatter and the raised weld, if there is any left over, will be on the inside. So pretty much with my gloves on, of course, I'm going to take the copper, put it behind the panel, and then just start on the metal and work my way in, kind of doing a spiral towards the center of the hole. I'm going to film it, so this is my first time filming a weld, so if it's rubbish, I apologize. So here's how the weld turned out. I'm pretty happy with it. As you can see, all the raised material is mainly on the inside here. Same goes for this hole. The hole at the front here was the biggest hole. Not bad. You might have been able to tell from the video, but I just made sure to take my time so I didn't overheat and distort the panel. Let me show you guys the other side real quick. So the other side's not so pretty. There is a lot of holes and stuff because, of course, the side isn't perfectly flat. But over here, the copper worked really well. It's pretty much perfectly flush. So right now I'm going to take my flap wheel and make sure these are a little bit under the surface because I'll do a skim layer of bondo on all 3 of those. And then the back side I'm going to leave pretty much the same, just clean it up a very little bit. So until the panel is installed, that's how I'm going to leave it, just like that. I have ground down the welds that are above the surface and just a little bit of the surrounding area so that you can just do a skim layer of bondo. I know this car, the panel that this car is off of has already been painted. So there's a lot of layers of, looks like primer, paint. Maybe a skim layer of Bondo for whatever reason, but I really don't think so. I think that's just like a lot of paint in there. But anyway, that's them ground down flush. Also, I can do this after it's welded onto the car. So now I'm going to flip it back over and get rid of all the rust on the inside of the panel. As promised, I cleaned up the entire panel. I used a mixture of a wire wheel and the floppy disc on my grinder. So let's take a look at what I did. Basically, I just took off all of the surface rust on the inside. Most of it was around either a spot weld or one of these square holes, which is what you put a screw through. So it chips the paint 30 years ago and just rusts slowly ever since. There was also a bit of rust on these inside flanges here. This location is right up against another surface, but it's not spot welded, so I think it rubs over time. So I just got that out there. If you are doing this, I recommend that even if you don't see rust near these holes, wire wheel them anyway, because oftentimes just below the first surface of paint you will find some surface rust. Nothing that'll probably come through in the next 10 years, but if you're doing it, you might as well do it right. So I've gotten all the rust off and then prepared it with some wax and grease remover. And then the only other thing I've done so far is I was unable to get every last bit of molecular rust on the wheel arch area and these 3 holes. So I got out a little brush and just put a little bit of rust converter. So even though I wire wheeled off the main bit of rust, rust likes to pit in the metal. So from what I've read, I used just a little bit of rust converter. As you can see, it's turning purple or black, which means it's working. Same with on that surface there. So that turns it into a nice primed surface. So I'm going to leave that to sit overnight before I prime it with some weld-through primer for extra protection. But on all of the other surfaces that I am not welding on, I am going to paint now with some self-etching primer. This is the last time you'll see the inside of the quarter panel, but I'll show you how good it looks now. Like I said, we did some priming, and then once we were done priming, my OCD showed through, and I decided to paint the inside of the panel with just some color match Toyota paint. So as you can see, I painted all the surfaces except for the flanges. It pretty much looks like a mirror copy of the chassis side. I didn't do any painting back here because I'll be painting the entire frunk area, and you can actually paint that while it's on the car, pretty much up until this area. So I just painted all of this. It makes me feel good if nothing else, and in theory it's a thicker layer of protection for a rock chip or rust to start forming through. Usually it does form from the underside of the paint, but I quite like it. So there's all the old trouble spots, perfectly rust free. And of course we got our weld-through primer on all of the flanges that we will be welding on. So this panel is 100% ready to finally be welded on the car. Well, after grabbing pretty much all the vice grips and clamps that I own, I think I finally have it properly positioned on the car. So a few tips and tricks I worked on was I kind of tried to start at a common point, put a vice grip there, then I would feel to make sure the flanges are completely flush. All the kind of ridges that should line up do line up. Sometimes you can look through an old spot weld drill and see the hole on the other side, but then I would move on and clamp another section, and then after I've clamped that section I would release the first clamp and then clamp it back down to kind of release any built up tension as the panel seats. Of course it fits on pretty nicely as it's the same car, but maybe because the dies are a little different, I found there was a bit of tension and restraint in some spots more than others. I basically made sure all the flanges are lined up together, which is why there's a vice grip here, for example, pinching the two flanges together, because when I did that, it shifted my C-pillar portion, so then I released these vice grips, clamped them back down, so now we have a nice even gap on this weld seam, for example, and it is nice and flush. All the kind of ridges line up very nicely. For now, I just have a few vice grips, but of course, when we're doing the actual weld, we're gonna put our vice grip right beside the pinch weld to make sure they're nice and tight together. Down here is pretty good. I put a bolt through this hole to kind of clamp this together. Same with this spot down here. Got a few clamps for the inner and outer fender area. All along here, no clamps here right now. That turned out really good. I don't think I'll be able to show you, but they're really close together. They'll just require a little squeeze and a weld and then fill it in with seam sealer, but that's the next step. Here I have one of those fancy spacer clamps. My cut wasn't very beautiful back here. I have a little piece I'm gonna have to fill in later. And the only kind of weird spot is right in the taillight area for me. I got this to line up really well. And this lines up decently over here. But this is a bit of a gap, and this is really flimsy. And if you pull it inwards, it does seal up really nicely. So I'm going to do a few tacks on the rest of the panel, and then I'm going to do a few tacks here. And of course, the first step is to do the tacking. I'm going to do probably 10 or so tack welds to make sure it doesn't fall apart. But then once it's all tacked on, I can take off the vice grips and test fit every panel like we did in the first video. To do the tacking, I am going to be using my Mastercraft MIG welder. Of course, with the gas hookup, it works really well. If anyone else has this welder, I'm going to be using minimum 2 at about 4.5 wire speed feed. And I have my ground hooked up to a nice clean patch of metal that touches the panel, so I know it'll always be good ground there. So I think I'm going to just go ahead and get some tack welds done, and I'll show you guys how it looks once it's finally tacked on. The panel has now been all tacked up. Let me show you guys a few examples of the tacks I did. So I wanted to do a few enough that I could easily remove it if I had to, but enough so that it wouldn't shift. So I just done a couple at every flange, then the odd spot weld. There's one there, one here. You guys probably remember the big gap that was back here. As you can see, it's really easy to close in because of how flimsy the material is. So I just have a couple tacks holding that on now. One there, and then one up here. I've tacked together this area a couple times. Here, here, here. And I did quite a bit here because it's a high stress because you have to push that in a little bit to get it to fit properly. I just went ahead and did all of these to make sure that this was nice and clamped together. This hole ended up lining up pretty good, but the weird part is that this one down here is definitely off a little bit. But luckily, I can definitely fix that. That's just a mounting hole for those side intakes. I'm really more concerned about the visible stuff lining up. And then, yep, just did a couple down here by the sill area, making sure that everything is flush, of course, is the key. And then a couple up here for this pinch weld. Did a couple in the middle to make sure it stayed together. It's amazing how few welds you need to hold it together. And then just one here and one here. So now the fun part. We're gonna see by putting on probably the vent. I might even grab a quarter window, rear bumper, trims, and tail light. We're gonna make sure that everything lines up, and I'll show you guys what it looks like all dressed up. Good news, everything fits very well. You can see I installed the bumper support, bumper, both side moldings. I even got my air intake. This air intake and the bumper get sandwiched in with these side moldings on the MR2, which really bolts it all together very nicely. I even set in my tail light there to make sure the gaps are good. I'll show you what I mean. So it is just sitting in there, but you can look through the screw holes to make sure the screw holes line up with the kind of space behind them. And then of course the gap right there is what you're looking for. I think it looks very good. The bumper arch between the air intake, quarter panel, and bumper, the arch looks very round. I haven't screwed these up. These have screws that go up into the quarter panel, the molding pieces, but the arch looks very circular and round, not notchy or anything like that. The air intake fits very nicely, and this surface here is nice and flush right there. All the holes lined up for the air intake and all the moldings. The quarter window is in the back of my other car with a few feet of snow on top of it, so I'm not going to get that out right now. But essentially, I know that as long as my gaps are nice and clean, it should fit very nicely. So, now we have confirmed that the panel is in the correct spot. It's time to weld on the entire thing. So now it's time to do some actual welding. I've done some practices here and another little line of stitch welds right here. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of work from this stitch weld actually. Kind of right here over to here. This is a little too far to do in one pass. I like to do about 1 inch or so at a time, so I'll do this in 2 passes to prevent the panels from heating up too much. So let me show you guys some tips and tricks. I'm sure my camera won't pick up the welding too much, but first I'll start with the trick. Hopefully you guys can see this here. I think you can. So as you can see, my MIG welder has a little ball on the end right there. So that will take more heat than the 23 thou wire. So we're going to go ahead and cut that off before we start our weld every single time. Now it's a nice precision small piece of wire. So what we're going to do is point it right at the start of the first weld, and we're just going to hit that trigger for a fraction of a second, and then we're going to watch it, and once it is pretty much gray, fully cooled, but still a little orange, we're going to hit it again, overlapping. So you can see here I have a gap. I can stick my fingernail in it. So I've turned the machine down because we will still get penetration without full power. These are used steel panels, so you can burn through them quite easily. So let's go ahead and do some welding. Here's the weld I just did. Definitely not my prettiest, but will definitely get the job done. You can see where I start and stop is kind of like right there. You're kind of not perfect, but then by the time you get going from like here to here, it's actually really good for what it has to do. You can see the bead, the dime overlap, and you can see if it goes a little too long, that's kind of what happens. You start to burn through a little bit. Also, there was minor corrosion there, so it's a little thinner material. Let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like from inside the panel. So I'm not sure how well you guys can see that, but that's inside the panel. You can see we got some nice, good full penetration there. Some areas a little better than others. Probably could turn the heat up a little bit, but I'm a little worried I'm going to burn through. So I'm probably going to keep it at that heat setting because it's pretty much flush on the back, meaning the weld went all the way through. Really happy with that. Of course, I burned the inside a little bit, but that's okay. So let's go ahead and finish up the welding. Welding is all done on the quarter panel. I haven't done any grinding, but let me give you guys a quick tour. So I've done all my butt welds down here. Here's a bunch of spot welds. The way I was doing it by plug welding, basically, they're not flush at all, so I have to grind them all down. But that's okay, because the only other way to do it is with an actual spot welder or a TIG. But I had holes, so I had to do it this way. We got our butt weld there. It's all raised up, and I have to grind it all down. But the key is that it's fully penetrated through all the metal. As you can see, where all the butt welds are, the seams are nice and close together. I use my vice grips to pull them in before welding. Here's the roof weld, the one I was most scared about. I think I did a pretty good job on that, all considering. If you look from the inside, you guys, I don't think you'll be able to see it. Kind of, if you look in there, you can see it's full all the way through. So when I grind it flush, it'll still be nice and strong. Got all of our welds down this top seam here. And then here's where things got a little crazy. There wasn't any holes in here to do my spot welds, and I went a little bit YOLO and completely welded this seam together as well as this seam here. This was the one with that big gap, so I had to continuously hammer it together, and I really didn't want it popping off, and I'm not going for factory anyway, so I literally just got out my welder and stitch welded the entire thing as well as a few plug welds. So that's super strong. When I grind it smooth, it'll actually look a lot better. Not the prettiest welds, but again, we did achieve some good full penetration. You can see the discoloration there and down there a little bit off camera, but anyway, you saw the strip along here of the weld all along here, nice and strong, and then a few spot welds up on the wheel arch that of course have to be ground flush as well. So there's the entire quarter panel all welded on. Next up, I'm going to be doing the lower sill to complete this welding for this side of the car. So what I wanted to do first is figure out how long the piece of metal has to be based on the arch. So I got a piece of cardboard like this and just kind of started at the bottom, bent it up, and I figured out we need 6 inches of metal this way and pretty much exactly 24 inches or 2 feet that way, which works out really well because the piece of metal I have is about 2 feet this way. So I used my square there to cut out 6 inches. So now I'm going to use the angle grinder to cut this off. By the way, I believe this here is a 20 or 22 gauge, I can't quite remember. But this is what we're going to be using to rebuild that sill. Here's what I've got so far. I'll walk you kind of through how I did it. So I took the panel and using some vice grips, I clamped it onto the bottom flange. I guess before I did that, I had to make the flange. I just did that with some pliers, but if you have a brake, that'd be a lot easier. So I just kind of measured what was on there. 15 millimeters was my measurement. Then I just bent it 90 degrees straight across. And then I heated it up with a torch and kind of bent it over the current sill. Now, of course, that's not the correct angle, but it is started. As you can see, it kind of is started because metal always wants to bend back to the way it was before, unless you, of course, plastically deform it. Anywho, once I had that shape, I took it back off, and I transferred some holes from the other sill, the rusty one that came off of it. So these are my plug welding or spot welding holes, and this one is a drain hole that gets a little grommet. I put that in a very similar spot as factory, and where it goes is right here. It's right in front of the rear sill portion and behind that box, kind of exactly where you'd think water would want to drain out of, so that's where it is. So then I, of course, spray painted the inside with some weld through primer. So now what we're going to do is mock this one up, use my vice grips to clamp it along the bottom flange in a couple different spots, and then I'm going to follow the arc of the existing sill panel and tack weld it as I go, then do some tacks across the top, and let's see if we can get it matched up to the rest of the sill. The sill has been welded on and I'm very happy with the results. You guys saw the piece I just made, so I kind of took a similar approach to how I made the piece, and I started by clamping with some vice grips, 4 vice grips along the bottom to keep the bottom flange nice and flush. And then I had the shape mostly bent, but because metal's quite elastic, especially sheet metal, it was kind of sticking out about an inch or so right here. So what I did was I grabbed my torch and I heated up right where I knew the bend would be, right along this surface right here. Heated up quite hot, but not too hot to burn off my paint and primer on the inside. And then starting it around kind of the middle with my glove on, of course, I pushed quite hard until I was butted up against this surface here. Did about a half an inch of some stitch welds, and then kind of went along in either direction. And then for the curve, I did the same thing, kind of met it up. Starting at the bottom, did a tack weld, tack it, and then where I knew there'd be a lot of tension, I put a bit more than a tack. And overall, I would say it worked out very well. You can see the glare from the light really helps to show the contours. I can try and show you guys without the light for a second. It's a little easier to see, but I'm really happy with it. For a hand bent piece, it matches the sill very nicely. And since we did such a good job on the rear inner sill, butt up against that, it worked very nicely. I did my spot welds on the bottom, attaching it to that inner sill. So then the next step was to make the sill end plate. So to make the sill end plate, I do it the same way as I do kind of every other piece of metal. And I start off with a piece of cardboard. So I goes like this. Got a piece of cardboard, cut it perfectly to what I want, something that fits against this surface and follows this contour. So I had this guy here, and then I traced it and cut it out of a piece of metal. So here's my sill end plate. I have weld through primer the inside, so it goes something like that. And you can see I drilled 3 holes in it for plug welding against the inner sill. So once that dries up, I'm going to go ahead and tack her on there. And then, as you can see, all I have to do is cut off the excess, the overhang from my outer sill panel. And then that's all tacked up and ready to get the final weld. Huge accomplishment for this quarter panel install. We are finally done all of the welding. You've seen everything before except for the sill panel, so let's take a look quickly here. It's not beautiful, of course, but I had the heat up nice and high with very low trigger time for my stitch welding. Some spots are much better than others. For example, it was a little bit thin here on this panel, so it burned through, so I had to go put a little more metal down than I would have liked. But the idea is that it is fully through, so when I go and grind it, it doesn't just get really thin and want to break. Of course, we've got our spot welds all underneath, and the end plate is fully welded on as well. The next very important step is grinding down all of the welds. For this, I'm going to be using my grinder mainly with this floppy disc. I also have some regular grinding wheels, the thicker type if I have to use them in some areas. I also have a little Dremel here with a metal cutting bit. You can see it there. Very, very sharp and strong. I also have a 2-inch bit, a 2-inch cutoff wheel for the Dremel, as well as these little 80 grit sanding discs. So lots of options there. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and grind down every spot weld and every weld flush. I'm going to be taking it right flush to the metal because you can add a skim layer of bondo over top to kind of blend it together. But if there's a ridge like there is now, that's impossible to fix up. And it's okay to go down to the metal because we know that there's full penetration through to the other side. So we're not going to go ahead and make that joint weak or anything. So let me go ahead and take my time and get the grinding perfect. Getting really close now. I have ground down all the welds. Basically, I didn't do a crazy good job if I knew I wasn't going to see it, because why would I bother risking compromising the strength? I know they go all the way through, but still better safe than sorry. Down here, I have ground all the welds down. Over here, I might still do a little skim layer of bondo just to say I did, but as you can see, it really doesn't need it. I will be doing some bondo here for the sill transition and the transition up here. I will be doing a skim layer of bondo for the roof area and a skim layer for each spoiler hole. The reason that this is all bare metal is because that wavy phenomenon you saw before was, I think, moisture from the spoiler holes going under the self-etching primer from factory and ruining it. And this panel also has a small dent here that I'm just going to do a skim layer of bondo over top of as well. And then, yeah, once the bondo is done, it's pretty much time for paint. So I'm going to go ahead and lay the bondo, sand it. That's nothing exciting. I'll see you when we're ready for paint. As promised, here's the panel just before I'm about to paint it. I did my bondo work on top of the ground down welds. As you can see, it's not too much bondo. The green bondo is the bondo from the previous repair, and the pink stuff's mine. I did my absolute best job sanding it with my block, my sanding block. It's the only way to do it, as I'm sure most of you know. Sanded down my bondo for my 3 spoiler holes, which is necessary, and a very skim amount of bondo here where that little dent was. Also in my sanding, I took off some high spots from previous paint jobs and chips. That there was a chip that I sanded smooth. I did a little bit of bondo on the top here, and of course I smoothed out the section where the sills met. You can see the amount of buildup on the sill panel from primer, the rough paint, etc. And one other thing I wanted to show you was the sanding technique. You really want to make sure that you get this nice feathering before you paint to make sure it's going to be blended in nice. As you can see, my car is being primed and painted from the factory, then primed and painted again, and now we're going to do it one more time. Luckily, it seems like it's pretty thin paint. It's not chipping anywhere, and it was done quite well, so I'm not too worried about that. I have some rough masking, so I know where I'm kind of going to stop, because none of this here is degreased and sanded. Then of course I sanded 80 grit to get down to the bare metal and the bondo, 120, 220, then 400. So now it's scuffed but no insanely deep scratches. There's my tape off job there. So we're going to be painting from this half of the roof over. We're going to be painting inside the car up in there. We're going to be painting that side panel inside the quarter panel to get those welds really good. Outside the quarter panel, wheel arches, everything like that. You can see I also did some rust converter where I wasn't able to get absolutely every bit of rust. Nothing was visible to the naked eye. It was just where I saw a little bit of pitting and I knew there could potentially be some rust in there is where I hit it with the rust converter. So now it's 100% ready for painting. We're not going to be painting it in this video, just priming, because I'm not going to paint it until everything else is ready. I'm going to be priming it with this Proform Direct to Metal 2K, so 2-part high build primer. And then there's the catalyst for the primer. I mix it in a 4:1 ratio with one of these mixing cups. And then I'm going to be spraying it with my Eastwood Conkers 2 paint gun with a 1.7mm nozzle. If I had a 2mm nozzle, I would use it, but I don't. So of course I've got my safety gear. I'm going to give it one more hit with this tack rag to get all the dust off of it. It's already degreased. So let's go ahead and do a time lapse to finish off this video. So that's it. That's the quarter panel fully replaced and painted. Let me show you guys the end result. I'm pretty happy with my work, my welding, my bondo, and my painting. Of course, this is just primer, but I'm still really happy with how it turned out. Let me show you guys some of the other areas. Super clean, especially compared to before. This type of repair should last for as long as I will ever own the car. Some inside, can't see that, but it's just as nice as you know. So that's it. Aside from this, I've got a bit of wet sanding to do once it's fully dry, of course, and then color once the other side is done and the engine bay. So there she is. I hope you guys enjoyed this really long two-part series. Let me show you guys up in here quickly. Super clean, absolutely no rust. But yeah, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this really long two-part series. I know it's not going to get too many views, but hopefully it helps the odd person. Even if you don't own an MR2, I hope the techniques were helpful and you can apply them on whatever car you're working on. So thanks for watching me work on my MR2. Please subscribe if you want to see it all painted and pretty. And as always, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.